Really delighted to introduce Matt, who's going to talk about how he uses one of our AM Archives Direct projects. I feel like hotly anticipated now, Matt, after that panel, which is great. But I'm just going to open really briefly by talking about some of the production processes behind the collections, how our editorial work and the technology that we use supports our efforts to make them as accessible and discoverable as possible. So you've heard a little bit of this already today, but just to kind of give an overview of AM Archives Direct as a content series, it encompasses collections exclusively sourced from the TNA, roughly covering diplomatic relations between the UK government and the rest of the world through the 19th and 20th centuries. It started, as we mentioned, with the CD-ROM, which, yeah, I'm sure a few of us in this room are ashamed to say that we definitely remember the days. That was the Macmillan Cabinet Papers, and our first online collection was the Nixon Years in 2008. And then I've got 2 bullet points that just blithely go through 20 years of steady digitization, huge amounts of content, lots and lots of releases up until the point where we had 30 distinct collections encompassed within 14 titles. And last year we released the 4th module of the Apartheid South Africa resource and the 2nd module of our Conflict in Indochina resource. Last year was also the year, as Nick previously mentioned, that we migrated all of that content onto the AM Cortex platform, which is our in-house platform. And it's the strength of our partnership, really, with the TNA and the huge potential of the huge amount of still undigitized sources within these series that we share the ambition to continue to grow AM Archives Direct quite significantly, to increase the breadth and the research opportunities in the content series. So that's looking at 2025, 2026, and far beyond, hopefully. So we didn't want any limits to be put on that ambition in terms of our platform or the technical capacity. That's why at the beginning of 2024, we did decide to kind of reimagine the AM Archives Direct suite, which went from a single portal that encompassed those 14 titles, 30 modules, and we moved it into AM Cortex, which gave us the ability to host each of those titles in a dedicated site, as well as having an additional aggregated search layer enabling cross-searchability across the whole suite as well. Moving that entire series, thousands of documents, hundreds of thousands of images, was a huge project for my team, many hundreds of hours of effort, including, just as a small part of that, generating transcripts for all of the handwritten material from previous collections that had been released before that technology was available, so giving a real boost of discoverability across the board and giving parity to the transcriptions available. AM Archives Direct really is a kind of living and breathing content series, and now it's got the platform to match, hopefully, that longevity and that continued relevance. The 4th module of Apartheid South Africa, as mentioned, was released this year in April, so I'd like to take that as an example of some of the elements that AM's editorial and platform teams add to support students like Matt's and users of AM Archives Direct across the world. So our production processes start with digitization. We're very lucky to have a dedicated set of scanners here on site at the TNA that are exclusively digitizing collections for AM all the time. So we are very grateful for the support from the TNA licensing team, the conservation staff, and the curatorial staff as well to make that possible. We also benefit from the TNA Discovery Catalogue and the data there, and then part of our team's work is supplementing it with additional metadata that supports browsing pathways. So Apartheid South Africa, the Resistance, Sanctions and Reform module was the first one to be released newly in AM Cortex. It didn't move from the old platform. That was its first and only home. And as such, we've been able to take advantage of the significant improvements to search and discovery, so including that in-platform transcript generation for printed documents and handwritten documents with our highest ever accuracy ratings for those transcripts. For the release of this collection and then rolled out to the whole AM Archives Direct suite, our in-house engineering team also created a brand new piece of functionality, which was hard-coded related search terms. With the support of advisors like Matt and the rest of the editorial board, our team created a data set of key search terms, which included alternative spellings, alternative versions of personal names, things like toponymic alternatives for cities and countries that were relevant to the collections. So this feature, this is what I've got a screenshot of here, means that if a user searches for Cape Town, for example, the system searches for that, but it also searches for some alternatives, including the Afrikaans Kaapstad. So it saves the user running 2 separate searches if they know the Afrikaans name. It broadens their search capability if they don't know that, and it provides the most comprehensive set of results. But users do have the option to toggle this off as well if, for example, they're using that keyword because they want to have the instances where that search term appears in its specific terms only. So there's that flexibility. Understanding the behavior of our users is really key to how we develop that technology and how we decide to employ it, as well as the effort of our editorial teams in terms of how best to support the primary sources. We know that some of that user behavior can be driven by the Google effect and undergraduates kind of coming to digital sources for the first time, as an example, do tend to default to keyword searching, and they do actually expect a kind of similarly powerful and intuitive experience across a range of platforms. If they're presented with a completely different experience, they might be slow to adapt to that. They might not have the tools to adapt to that. And instructors like Matt are really key in supporting them to ensuring that library resources are maximised. But it's also incumbent on us as the publisher to understand that behaviour. And AM's continued investment in things like our transcript technology is really vital in kind of responding to that user behaviour and optimising discovery pathways. But of course, keyword searching as a behaviour isn't universal. It's not necessarily kind of optimum either. So one of our aims is to provide multiple browsing pathways through our sources, so that there are access points and ways in that can reflect and serve a range of learning styles. One of the ways we do that is through our popular searches list. So there are lists of terms relating to people, places, and topics relevant for each of the specific collections. And they support students kind of browsing across those collections and offering insights into the topical coverage for those who are looking for that starting point. And then for users who come with a greater degree of prior familiarity, an update we made for the release of Apartheid South Africa this year was the creation of a reference search directory. So that enables users to filter by specific department, so for example, the Foreign Office or the Treasury within AM Archives Direct, or even by a specific series. We know that's really helpful for users at the TNA on site here, including staff who bring that really high degree of familiarity with the collections and their structure. They might even have a specific kind of piece reference that they're looking to use to navigate, so they can do that now. And really, by offering the range of functionality and the range of data, the collections support the TNA in making the best use of the collection on site here at Kew, as well as researchers of all levels around the world. We know we've just about scratched the surface in terms of what has been digitised from the TNA, and the government keeps on working, so that information and knowledge is being generated all the time. That is going to be the subject of future study. We hear feedback from librarians that sometimes students underestimate the degree to which digitised archives really do represent just the tip of the iceberg. They can make assumptions that the library catalogue encompasses all of the available knowledge. And we need to continue to educate about how much more TNA and other archives have to offer to support student success. But it's also imperative that we make what is available as easily discoverable and at their fingertips as we can, so that we're responding to researchers, to how they work, to what they need, and hopefully empowering the next generation of research to be as high quality as possible. And that's enough from me. I'm going to pass over to Matt now. Thanks a lot.
So hi everybody. First of all, I want to say thank you to AM for putting on this great day, and also for inviting me along to speak, and also for you for all to turn up today to hear us talk a little bit about the assignment that I've put on using the AM collection. My name's Matt, and I teach a course on South African history at the University of Dundee. So what I'm going to do in today's session is first of all talk a bit about the kind of broader kind of collection and the assignment itself. I have kind of euphemistically called it becoming a historian. I mean, hopefully they're already on the way to becoming historians, but this is the best way I could think of it in terms of describing the assignment itself. And then we'll look a little bit about the kind of benefits for the students themselves, what they gain from it, and also talk a bit about the outcomes and some of the experiences too. We've talked a little bit about some of the materials already in the previous panel session, so I'll just add a bit more detail to some of those as well, or maybe skirt around others which we've already focused on in more detail. I should say that it's probably about 2016, AM came up to the University of Dundee to basically pitch getting this collection, and the dean of school at the time saw it very much as an academic research tool. So he was like, this collection is going to be for the benefit of the academics. And when I actually thought about it and actually looked at it, I was like, well, yeah, that's fine, but also what else can we do with the material? And this project that I'm going to talk about came out of me reflecting on that material. But also, I should emphasize is that the way in which I have put this assignment on has gone through several iterations, as I myself have learned through the process of using the collection and also responding to student experiences too. And I love thinking about pedagogy. I really enjoy the kind of teaching element of my job. It's great to be able to be enthusiastic about my historical passion of South Africa, and hopefully passing that on to a new generation of students who, you know, if we put it into context, are 6,000 miles away from South Africa. So why should they be interested in this topic? So, as we've already heard, is that the collection is premised in the materials of the National Archive. So this is kind of the, inverted commas, the official mind. This is the governmental documents that have been recorded and also preserved about apartheid South Africa. And this is the way in which the government have either discussed the issues going on within the country, the ways in which South Africa was being kind of considered on the international stage, and the evolution of that from the 1940s through to the 1980s, which is obviously a big part of this component. And also the kind of the diplomatic records that are coming through from those based within South Africa themselves. And so one of the great things about the archive is just the plethora of materials that can be accessed. And again, these are some of the things that have already been discussed, and I'm sure you are fully aware of some of the things that you can get access to. But what I think is really good is that the National Archive acts as that kind of hub for all of these different things, which give us different messages and different narratives about apartheid, about how it was considered, and about the ways in which Britain responded to the various crises that were occurring there. And so things like the diplomatic reports are often very useful, because that gives us actually sometimes the contradictions that are going on. Like, the official government supported apartheid. South Africa was supported by the British government. But you would see the diplomats going like, oh, we shouldn't really be thinking about it this way. Like, we should be reconsidering the ways in which we are even like kind of discussing negotiations with resistance groups or what have you. So sometimes you can see again those alternative messages coming through the diplomatic reports. And some of the things like the annual country reports are also really useful in giving kind of like the economic data, and particularly in the 1980s when South Africa is kind of being isolated on the international stage, you can get a really good sense of how that kind of broader kind of economic boycott really kind of started to hit into the South African government. So the module that I teach is called Apartheid, African Liberation and Democracy. Now, this module broadly, first of all, it's a final year optional module. So in Scotland, we have a 4-year degree, and so this is placed in the 4th year. And it usually sits before the students do their dissertation. So as I'm going to really emphasize, is that this assignment is a fantastic bridge between the kind of theoretical classes that we do versus the actual kind of final dissertation which they complete on their degree. Usually there's about 25 to 30 students on it, so which is great that so many students want to take the subject. And as a kind of, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. We have 12 weeks to get through rather a lot of content. But the good thing is about like kind of South Africa, I think, is it offers a really good case study to consider lots of other different issues. It is not just about South Africa. It is stories of kind of human rights. It's the stories of struggles against injustices and oppression. It is the way in which the Cold War really backdropped and framed the issues, and the way in which that then dictated government policies in different parts of the world, and also the ways in which different resistance groups appealed for support both at home and also abroad as well. So the module really draws in lots of different content and also makes sure that it is situated within its broader contextual issues. And the archives I'm going to be talking about are really, really useful. I mean, we do cover it very, like, chronologically. We begin in 1948 and we finish kind of roughly about 2012. But through that, we bring out these broad themes. So that's the kind of the module itself. Now, I think we've already discussed this in the panel in various ways, but I really want to stress just how crucial for studying South African history resources like this are. It'd be very, very difficult for me to do what I do without access to these things. Now, there are various other digital resources based in South Africa that we have access to as well. So there is a broader suite of materials. But it enables my students, who I said are 6,000 miles away, to actually have some connection to South Africa, a country which they probably would not really have thought about too much. Also, as we move further beyond the advent of democracy, which was 30 years ago now, is that, shockingly, some of them are not sure who Nelson Mandela is. So that's also a little bit like, okay, we need to actually, go backwards a bit. So having these resources are absolutely fundamental, because it's not just about the assignment. Every single class has primary sources based within it. Some of them are provided by myself, and others are brought in by the students too. So this resource is fantastic for that purpose. So the entire purpose of the module is to really get them to grips with the content of South Africa, but also to try and give them as much of an essence of it as possible through the primary sources, because hopefully we all agree that is the most exciting bit. That is the bit where kind of the history comes together. And it really then allows them to kind of analyze those materials. So one thing that I'm really keen on doing is that I'll maybe identify, like a little pack of materials, maybe 5 or 6 documents, then give each student one document to analyze, to really consider that material, and then they have to pair up and layer the materials with the others. So we really get to get that contextualization component, but also really get to understand why there can be such radical differences within the materials that we might look at on a particular topic. Now, one thing that is, I think, really beneficial about the AM collection is its ease of use. And Hannah said, you can go through it very quickly, and also understand its materials, and using the keyword searches are absolutely fantastic. I should say, though, is that when I first began this project, kind of took it for granted how much students knew and how they would use that material, and actually kind of faced quite a lot of very practical questions about how to use the archive and how to use that material, which then made me reflect on, well, why are they not sure about what words to use, or where are the best ways of finding out the information? So I must admit that first time I did it, just let them get on with it. Probably didn't go the way I wanted it to go, but again, that's part of it. Accepting that these things don't always go the way we want to. And so since then, I always spend an entire workshop, an hour's class, giving them the hows and the whats with the archive itself. So I'd sit in the room, we'll have the archive up on the big screen, get them to kind of use keywords, and then identify how we might go about using that material in a broader project. So really, we talked about kind of scaffolding earlier, but I think the scaffolding element is absolutely vital in the kind of the assignment and the broader teaching. But also, because the archive is the official British archive, it can be seen as this kind of top-down, bureaucratic kind of collection of materials. But actually, again, as we talked about in the panel session earlier, is one of the most exciting parts of it is actually the alternative stories that you can find, the ways in which you can read against the grain, the way in which you can find out about the various resistance movements, because a big part of the module I teach is about resistance, and it's about the struggles against white minority rule. So how can we use that archival collection? And one of the really nice things I think about this selection, but also about where the module sits in our curriculum, is that we have a theoretical module that all students have to take in their third year, which gives them ideas about empiricism and postmodernism and also post-colonialism and reading against the grain. And this is a perfect opportunity for them to use that theoretical training in a very, very practical way. And one of the things that students really appreciate and really do say is that sometimes it's hard to put those abstract concepts into practice, and this is a really good way of putting it into practice. So it's really then trying to then set that material against the secondary literature and the way in which they then understand that positionality. So, as I said, the assignment is called, which I said called Becoming a Historian. And so the whole point is to try to give them a flavour of what myself and my colleagues do as part of our research process. So against the broader themes of the module, apartheid, African liberation and democracy, they are tasked with finding or identifying a theme or a research question that they want to look at. So it must be connected to the module, and it needs to be situated within the materials. Obviously, stuff from the 2010s is not going to be in this collection due to the declassification and the 30-year rule as well. So the first part of the project is to come up with that question. And then the second part of it is to actually test the viability. Because any research question that any researcher does has to be tested. Can you actually do what you want to do? So for example, like several students in the past have, it's not really in this collection, but have said, well, I want to study like the Angolan Civil War and the ways in which South Africa impacted the activities there. And if I say to them, well, do you speak Portuguese? And they're like, no, well, then the viability of your project has already hit a barrier. So part of the training that I mentioned a minute ago, but also the assignment itself is to give them that experience of testing whether a research question can be achieved through the materials they have access. Because lots of things are hypothetically possible, but actually as historians we find that sometimes they're not, just we can't find that information. So they have to look through the collections to test that viability. They then create a mini proposal, so they come to me and say, this is going to be my question. I'll give you a few examples in a minute. And then say, here are some of the sources that I found through the materials, and this is how I'm going to analyze it and create an argument. So they have to use at least 8 different primary sources. So it's a decent chunk. But again, as I said in the panel session, is that I expect that they have looked at far more than the 8 to ensure that those 8 are the most appropriate for the project they are about to do. But these primary sources can be in any format through the archive as well. And I think this is a really big part of it. Like, it's not insisting that a primary source is the minutes of a meeting. It is the photos or the maps or whatever that they have found. And other archives can provide different things, like the ITN archive, for example, can bring in the video reporting or what have you if they need to. But 8 different primary sources have to be selected. And then they write a 2,500 word analysis based on those primary sources. And the key part is in the context of the academic literature. This assignment comes at the end of the module, so they have done lots of reading for their tutorials, they have done reading for the other assignments. And so again, it's giving them that scaffolding of the historiography and being able to then test that historiography through the primary sources that they have found. But I would not be able to do this project without this resource. That is probably one of the key things I should say, is that it'd be very, very because I would have to give them the primary sources that I want them to do, or I'd have to send them on a train, on a field trip to the TNA in person. So this resource is absolutely fundamental to this assignment. And I've just picked out 4 different topics that students have picked. And you don't need to know anything about South Africa or apartheid, but these are just 4 of the topics that I thought actually give you a sense of the scope that can be found within the collection itself. So one of the kind of core underpinnings of apartheid was segregation and separate development, and in particular was the segregation of urban spaces across South Africa, and about how the government conceptualized that, and then secondly, how they then actually implemented that. And so one of the students decided that this was going to be a project and was able to look at some of the diplomatic materials, look at some of the ways in which it was reported, look at some of the maps that are also in the collection, and think about how South Africa was radically reimagined under apartheid. And so that was I thought, a really innovative way of thinking about the project of apartheid and about how it was then implemented and also reported from out with South Africa. Another part of apartheid was two parts of apartheid, but this one notion was the idea of grand apartheid. That essentially, the non-white populations of South Africa were not citizens of South Africa. So only whites were citizens of South Africa under apartheid, which then meant that they divided the country into the so-called homelands or Bantustans, which again was some of the things about alternative usage and terminology through the search engines. And essentially, this was the way in which South Africa was segregated based on perceived ethnic groups. And the student was looking into the project of how the government tried to do this, but also the sheer irrationality of this and how it kind of broke down as various peoples in South Africa resisted against being essentially internally deported within their own homeland. So again, it was a really interesting project about how you could take a piece of legislation but then also think about it in very, very different ways. As I mentioned a few times in the panel session, one of them was on black consciousness and the idea of student resistance from the late 1960s through into the 1970s. And again, a different way of conceptualizing resistance within the country. And again, through the National Archive documents, is that these stories come through about the way in which diplomats or the various reporting kind of is thinking about how to respond to a new wave of resistance in South Africa. You know, the African National Congress was in exile. Its liberation struggle wasn't really going that well in the 1960s, but by the early 1970s, a new form of protest had emerged, particularly around kind of psychological liberation. And again, really interesting project to have identified within the collections. And finally, another one was the ways in which the African National Congress, particularly people like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, kind of led the beginning of the Freedom Charter, and also against the past laws as well. So again, fantastic project using official documentation to tell a different story of resistance as well. So 4 just broad examples that I think give you a quick snapshot of what can be achieved by using the materials, and actually what my students achieved through the materials as well. So when we're actually thinking about what are the students getting out of it, and I think with any assignment that we do, it's always going to be like, what is the purpose? Why are we doing this? And what do we hope for our students to get out of it? And we talked earlier in that panel about this idea of kind of giving them confidence and about trying to give them that autonomy. And I think a big part of a project like this is about that independence. They've developed loads of different skills through their studies, and this is an opportunity to put it to the test in one sense, and also give them that freedom to do that as well, which I think is really, really exciting. And it's also about, what are the things that historians are doing. We are, obviously collecting huge amounts of information. We are synthesizing that information. We are analyzing it, contextualizing it, and then also thinking about how it fits into the academic literature that pre-exists as well. And so again, this is a really good way of getting them to think about those processes and the stages of a broader research project. And the one thing that I like with many of the other kind of projects I've done with students in other modules is that if you give the students that autonomy, is that the results are usually fantastic because they have taken that ownership of it. They have come up with their question. They have then developed it in the various ways that they want to do it, which fits their interest. And then that themselves makes them much more excited about the primary sources, about being a historian or just finding out more about a particular theme or issue. And I cannot stress how much that is the bit that I think is the most exciting part of the project itself. As I said, it also fits neatly in the kind of academic curriculum between different stages of our degree. And so this is a relatively low stakes piece of work, which then sets them up into the much bigger piece of work of their final dissertation, which is between 10 and 11,000 words. And quite often the research that they've done in this project can act as that basis for the next stage. They've had an opportunity to do a lot of the groundwork and actually think about whether it is a viable dissertation or not. And I think that is a really exciting part of that broader, the broader theme of this. And also, one thing we have to be very conscious of is that most of my students will not go on to be historians. History is a wonderful subject to give them skills, to allow them to go into lots of other different careers. And we have to be very mindful of that. And actually, therefore, the things that we do in terms of the assignments and teaching and whatnot really fit into this. So part of these, I've just picked out a few here, but obviously that research process, the online digital literacies is actually a vital thing that I think sometimes we as academic staff often forget, and actually we have to pay close attention to. And I think these are things that can then be sold when they're packaging their skills or packaging their knowledges and experiences to employers. They can think, well, I've done this, I did this, I achieved that. So I think these are some really important parts of what the project itself can derive. I mean, this is just a small part of the degree, by the way. Like, I'm not claiming that they get all those skills just from this single assignment. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time reading these out. I mean, you can all see what they say, but here are some of the kind of the quotes from the end of module kind of questionnaire. And again, they really reiterate just some of the things that I said. As a good historian, I'm giving you the evidence to back up my claims. But this idea about kind of the freedom and this idea that they're not doing a set question or an exam. One thing that I think that everyone at AM should be so really pleased about is how easy it is, and breaking down, as I said in the earlier panel, is breaking down that fear about the assignment and about what they can do. So I think the ease of use and also about how they can actually pursue their interests through that material is absolutely fantastic. Also, this idea about kind of connectivity and about also being able to access these materials from somewhere like Dundee, and also the skills elements here as well. So yeah, I think these are some really nice ways of the students really emphasizing what they gained from the project and also how they perceived it too. So as I kind of begin to kind of wrap up then, I think that because of the geographic distance from South Africa to the UK, is that the collection here really does give them a great point of access into the country's history beyond me giving lectures or tutorials and the reading. This is a really nice way of them getting that underlying knowledge and also getting that passion for the subject itself. As I began the session today talking about is actually it's helped me with my pedagogy. I've actually had to think really quite carefully about what I do, how I do it, and also how best to improve the project itself. And also, thanks to AM as well, who have given me the opportunity to do those things too, and then help with their latest collection as well. So I think that has been a big part for myself. And also, it's this thing here, that the high standard of work that comes out of it is the most pleasing thing. That is the main thing that I want my students to do, is to produce good quality work to the best of their abilities. And a project like this, once you have created that scaffolding, created that framework, and given them the chance to explore, becomes a big part of creating those quality kind of outcomes. So these are some of the great parts of my experiences through the project itself. So that is a whistle-stop tour through my project. But if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask them. Go for it.
Asking those students to look at 8 different sources for their assignments, do you find that there's a particular kind of commonality, get drawn to a kind of do they like maps or looking at documents? Is there a sort of a theme that you see them picking up?
So quite often it's actually they're drawn to government minutes and diplomatic cables. Those are the kind of things, because they see those as being the official things, and the ones that might seem, I'm going to use the term lightly, the most authoritative. And therefore that is where they generally go. I think once they've made that once they got to the proposal stage of the assignment, and I can talk to them and go, well, have you thought about looking at these, or have you considered thinking about other things? That's where they then perhaps broaden their scope out. But yeah, generally they go to those kind of the official documentation rather than the maps first. And then it's when you go yeah, there's some other things out here. Then that's when they go for it.
I think the reference to maps is really interesting because I naively thought that maps were just a geographical representation of the world, and they're not, are they? They are political, they are economic, and I think that interrogation of maps and putting it alongside local content is really, really useful, I think, and it's something that I hadn't considered before, and that's some map curiosity. Taught me some valuable lessons.
Sure. Well, under apartheid, 93% of the entire of South Africa was designated as white. So therefore, the political underlying nature of the map there exists because of the political ideology of the time, but then also the impact that has on the black populations of South Africa and where they are then moved. So for example, the creation of the homelands in itself is the redrawing of the map of South Africa and then trying to enforce some form of, inverted commas, rationality onto the map, going, well, these people belong there, therefore you should go there, when actually in reality that never existed. And so again, you see that contradiction and clash just through the map itself. So yeah, maps are great. Like, they're really, really good ways of kind of getting to understand how a political entity is not always the social reality or political reality of the time. So yeah.
Yes, no one else does. My question was actually about the interweaving of a narrative behind the documents, and how do the students find that difficult? I mean, that's one of the things I always think is probably the most challenging thing, to have a documents that are quite disparate and to create a narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to the beginning, but they need that hook. They need a strong research question that will draw the different things together in a coherent way. And yes, they absolutely do find this a difficult thing, because they're like, well, how can this official government minute versus this like piece of propaganda from the South African government actually be connected? Can they be connected? And part of that, again, is trying to assure them that they can make the connection by analysing it or by thinking about the different messages, or again, the broader contextualisation of those different materials. So yes, there is an element from myself as the instructor to advise them on the best way to make that connection, to make that link, and how they can best bring the different things together. But one thing I really want to stress them is that actually they can have 8 disparate documents and that they can be brought together. And that's the exciting bit. How can their analysis, how can their question make that connection? Because, you know, as academic historians, that's something we're doing all the time. And so this is just on a much more like miniature version, I would say. So, but yeah, that it is a challenge. It's definitely, I know, to get them able to do that. But I think once you can make that reassurance, provide them the that confidence. I think it goes to confidence that they can make those connections, and that their research question that they've come up with is the right one to make that connection, they'll make that link. So yeah, that's, I think, the way.
You say that the nature of the content is quite sensitive. How do you approach that, or broach that conversation when you're looking at the material? For example, I work at SOAS, I'm a librarian there, and only about a year ago we created a trigger warning content policy, which is now clearly on our interface of our catalogue. But you know, we are aware that the material has obviously what would be termed offensive language and so forth. How do you approach that in the classroom?
I think that's a fantastic question. Okay, so the start at the very beginning of the module is that I begin with the UN official declaration, which said that apartheid was a crime against humanity. So you've initially got that front and center. We then have to obviously navigate the issue of that the apartheid was racism on a grand scale, and so having to get students aware of the terminologies that were being used and the sensitivity behind those things, but also remembering that this is not an abstract thing, that this thing is a reality, and the legacies of apartheid are still being played out to this day as well. Trigger warnings is about the only way that you can actually really warn the students of the nature of apartheid, because one thing that is quite useful, being a 20th century historian, is a lot of this was documented on film or in pictures. So that's good, because they can actually see and get a sense of what the day-to-day realities of apartheid were for the vast majority of the population. But the content of that is often really quite horrific. And so it's, again, having to warn them that this exists. But I think that part of my job is then to say to them is like, look, we cannot pretend that this didn't happen. And therefore, for you to understand the actual realities for the population of South Africa and to understand why they resisted in the ways they did, this is what we have to look at. This is what we have to see. So it's just being very cautious about the kinds of documents that we use and giving them advance warning that there is materials that might be incredibly upsetting, but also then saying that, you know, I'm here to help them and support them if they want to talk about something. So it's, again, really trying to be as understanding as possible. But I think with the very nature of the thing, that it is a crime against humanity. So therefore, like that sensitivity is absolutely vital. But trigger warnings is a key part of it. And then just trying to insist that actually this was a system that the legacies are being played out still to this day, and they affected everybody's day-to-day life from cradle to grave. And therefore, to understand this subject, we have to understand what happened. And so it might not be pleasant, but at the same time, it is necessary to see or think about these things in particular ways. So it's probably not the idea, well, maybe not the, there might be other ways around that, but that's one of the only ways I've been able to think about how doing this. But I think by premising it like crime against humanity, I don't know, that's under the official UN statement, is that then that really kind of frames what actually happened and why it became such an internationalized issue.